police employees, again, so that they're aware of it, and to perhaps begin to seek. So this is the end of that section, which is, I believe. So I've just any questions about any of that, so I can carry on. Okay, so I guess that's demonstrating some of those whys that there, in summary, suggest that there are points to there being an antenatal pathway and a postnatal pathway that at least differ. We now wanted to unpick a little bit more the genetic pathways. Again, it's you have to ask yourself, why do you need to know? Is that, we know there's a genetic pathway, why do we care? And I guess we care because if it's, well, a simplistic way to think about genetics, certainly at the outset, is if it's genetics, and there's not much, there's no point of all this early screening, and because you can't change it anyway. So if it's just as simple as that, why are we bothering? Perhaps we need to think about the child and their emotional support. So this was at the core of this EU grant, is actually one way to unpick that, how much is direct genetic transfer versus which might be due to the mum's phenotype herself, is to separate out the transmitted and untransmitted genetic risk. So put simply, okay, parents pass on genetic information to their children, but only 50%, right? So what you can do then is we just take the mum's genetic risk. You can separate out, and I won't go into the details of how, that her mental health risk that has been transmitted to the child and that isn't. Of particular interest is that if we've separated out this non-transmitted risk, the only way that would influence the child's outcome is via the phenotype, because we know it wasn't passed on. So this is a good test then, if there is any evidence that, irrespective of the genetic transfer, the mum's mental health is influencing the child. You can also separate out how much of an accumulation of both, because you can look at the strength of the association with what is directly transmitted and what is not, and there's likely to be accumulation, but you can separate that out. And then you kind of realise with genetic epidemiology that it's a very, very, very small association between your genetic signals and your phenotype. So you've got really, really, really low power. So this took 6-7 years to do, find enough cohorts that have not only mum, dad, and child data, because you have to, I won't go into it, people ask me afterwards, but you need the dad. And we've shown simulation, you need to have the dads. We tried it via haplotypes, didn't work reliably, so you do need to have the dad's genetic data too. Searched the world for this, held many symposiums. Eventually we did pull together enough cohorts that have a measured child outcome and mum, dad, child genetic scores. It is about to be submitted finally, and again, complicated study, years of work, simple-ish message that you find evidence for an untransmitted, so through the phenotype, only for mum, for dad, and only in the early years. You can see that there's, the genetic actually only begins to become apparent by adolescence, and then certainly by adulthood. And by adolescent adulthood, the untransmitted, through the mum's phenotype, if you like, associations are lost. There's one pretty important caveat, which we can't get around completely, is that in the early years, it's the time that the phenotype of the child is reported by the mum. So is the untransmitted effect actually just the mum's perception that her child has emotional problems? And I can't say that isn't the case. We've done a few things to say that it isn't. We've got some external reports. We've also shown that actually depressed women don't necessarily say their child's emotional. Actually, there's no real evidence for that. But nonetheless, it's tricky and it's unavoidable. You can't ask a 2-year-old, really. Nothing. I think the key message, though, of this is that there does seem to be some gains of thinking about the mum's mental health early on. So mental health support for parents, because of this early years effect, but probably our best conceptualization is to stop thinking about isolation of mum and child and think more about an emotionally vulnerable dyad. Okay, so it isn't the case that if it's genetic, there's nothing we can do at all. It's just that rather than saying if we treat the mum's symptoms, job done, because it's clearly not the case. Even if you did do that, the bidirectionality, the in utero, the early interactions, it's already set a path of this emotionally vulnerable dyad, is I think what we'd say. So we'll come back to that when we get to the intervention stuff. But it's an interesting way to think about what we can, this kind of transmitted, and they keep changing terms again, which must be even more annoying when it's a global language of English, but the term changing must be even more annoying and it has to be translated. But like the word genetic nurture, now no one likes genetic nurture as this kind of untransmitted. I think it might be called indirect, but you can't, in a mediation model, paths are also indirect, and so it's a complicated term, but it is an approach that's being used not just in mental health and education, in other areas to think about this kind of transmitted, untransmitted associations. That's quite cool. So again, this is just another way that when we did some of the lived experience work, my PhD students, is starting to think, okay, there are this genetic vulnerability, but we have to perhaps think of it in different ways. That's the kind of recipe, ingredients. Then after that is how the ingredients of the home environment, perhaps here with this emotionally vulnerable dyad. It depends what you get. If you get your kind of high class cheese or just cheese slices from Aldi, I don't know what Aldi is if you're not in the UK. And then of course it's the tools and the cook and how it's brought together, which might be many different influences on your life. And sometimes it's the kind of a generation of overthinking these things, and we think there's a simplistic way of all the wonderful, nice things going together, but how they come together is very different and different scenarios. So it's genetics is by far the most complicated pathway. In a way, you think it's simple. It's increasingly complex. And I'm just going to, my lovely daughter, actually over there, which until she's reached about 17, I would never have put up a mini-me picture, but she's become very, very similar to me. It's like, even of how she looks, which is surprising because she's half Jamaican and I obviously am not. But like her mannerisms, the way she talks and everything, has really come out. And that has this paper and this different way of looking at genetics has very much been inspired by my daughters. I've got 2, and their emotional response of this idea. One time, just realizing how different her response is to me, and that is what bothers her. It's not what you do; it's that you didn't quite get it. And I was at this wonderful. This is where Miguel was talking about where sometimes my brain does this in completely different areas. I was on this course with Beatrice Beebe, and she was about micro babies. If you ever know that, it's very, very psychoanalytic, Anna Freud Center. And she was talking about how, when she wants to be known, to know and be known. I don't expect she thought I'd then go and do some genetic study on that, but it just this idea that you are more similar to people in some ways. It's the same for like mentorships and things. Of course, we pass on average 50% of our DNA, but that's mixed across traits. Might be one trait you do, one trait you don't. So this idea of what we all need from relationships is our emotional understanding. we thought, okay, maybe we can look at genetics in a different way, not these very linear, these very mum, child, separate scores, but how similar you are on a trait, because that isn't something that's kind of evolved over time, which I would say me and Adele have through many complex journeys. And in fact, I should actually say, I've only just thought of it now, but she's got contact lenses in to make her eyes green. So that is definitely socially constructed, not her actual, that she likes to do sometimes. But okay, people become more similar, but have you got a helping hand if you started off more genetically similar? Anyone who's a parent will know those children that just think, why are you responding like that? I don't get it at all. So what we did in this paper is just to go through snip by snip for risk alleles for neuroticism and how similar the mum and child are, how similar father and mama and father and child. Cut long story short, I was so surprised. I didn't pre-register this hypothesis, but I have written it somewhere now. So now that we then looked at whether, and of course the mums have kind of no idea how genetically similar they are, and this is at a population level. Having a higher similarity was associated, especially for boys actually, but for reported enjoyment and higher quality of that early relationship in the first 3 years of life, again in the House of Black study. A lot of people think, well, that's just because they're both calm. It's driven by the both being low. And actually, it's not at all. It's actually, if anything, more driven by the high side. So it takes one to know one. Misery likes company is another phrase. And it was I probably shouldn't say this, but actually it was partly inspired that my slightly more neurotic older daughter would sometimes find it easier to talk to my neurotic dad. And I'd be like, oh, I struggle to think why would I want to talk to me about it, my nice sunny disposition, but it's because it's irritating for her. Someone who's having an emotional response, someone who's like, I don't know why you're bothered, is annoying apparently. Anyway, it's an interesting finding. We're looking at it in different ways. Like, so this is one where we think similarity is good. We're interested in risk tolerance as another one where maybe a mismatch might be good. It might change over time. This paper is I think I gave the citation, but we also replicated it with mum and dad and their reported relationship. So if they're both more similar in neuroticism, then they report a better marriage, actually, which is surprising. Well, not so surprising, but it's just I wasn't expecting to. So I call that mutually cooperative. I've made that term up. No one's stopped me yet in the paper, but I think that's. But I want to get away from, but it does hurt your head. Two separate entities, and even how they interact is a co-constructed association intergeneration. Okay. Any questions on the genetic stuff before we can come back to the end? But if there's any clarification or things.
So do you think there is some specificity around the mental health traits in terms of the evocative effect, or because there's the same methods being similarly applied for educational attainment?
Yeah, education is similar actually. They don't find it, but they don't. Okay. People are doing this in 2 small studies as well. It's underpowered, of course. I have found a genetic nurture for education. Nobody's done a proportion similarity.
Not yet.
Not yet. No. We're going to do it in MOBA on verbal processing. So PACE, I think it's another interesting thing. Like, well, I know, I'm a developmental psychologist, but one of the core constructs to supposedly a sensitive relationship responsiveness, and that's time dependent. Like some people would say you've responded, if you respond, like my children say I haven't responded in like 0.01 second, because we all have a higher fast processing speed, but that's a difference again, and that could be a mismatch in a relationship if people are at different spaces. So we thought that's interesting, but yeah, that's quite new, I think. And I was expecting it to go to peer review and someone say that doesn't work, like what you're doing. But actually it's been quite well received as a method, as you know, because you're on it. They don't like the report of parenting, but
it's what we have now.
It's challenging assumptions out there. There's nothing wrong with reporting how you feel. It just is different to what's observed. It's not better or worse. That's their experience. They are experiencing more enjoyment of that child. Doesn't mean they're in Bowlby's terms or Mary Ainsworth's terms, that construct of war, but it's what it is. So the kind of next part of work is to go a bit more in depth. Those studies thus far have taken not that big, but biggish population data, self-reports generally, and looking at patterns, right? That's psychiatric epidemiology, looking for patterns, triangulating inference around mechanisms. I'll dare to go up, I don't think I will. So this is just a figure to represent this children of the 90 studies, which are now these 3 generations. The G0, early pregnancy, is the findings that I talked about at the beginning with this kind of their mental health, and then how that links to their kids' mental health when they grew up. And the time that I got this lovely EU grant was just opportunistic, really, at the time that they were reaching parenthood. So then they become parents themselves, and we were lucky enough to then integrate in a smaller contained, as they became parents within this nested study, like understand parenting. So we, from all of that work just before, it's pretty clear something about the relationship's important but not understood. So we nested in some, and this is, I suppose, the digital. I've got them somewhere in my bag anyway. The original cams. Which apparently we started in 2018, but this was the pilot work. And if one of the things, a lot of the work based on parenting, although quite snobby about it sometimes, is there's a difference between the report, which is terrible, apparently, reports of parenting, and then we must use observational methods. But then anyone who's ever done an observation of a parent-child, either at home or in a lab, it's so artificial. You're there, and the baby and the mum are completely different. And I remember being told in the training, oh, the baby doesn't know that I'm doing a psychological study on them, but they know I'm a smiley, nice psychologist going hello, and they come and look at me, not look at their mum, and it's all different, right? And the mum's cleared up and fed them and tried to make them act exactly how they want to. So that's not criticism, that's just reality. So I understand that there are some kind of more automatic behaviours you still look at, but it just felt so we're basing a lot of things on something so flawed, really. So one thing we did, I won't give all details to talk about it later, is wearable cameras. There was a study somewhere, I don't know exactly where it originally came from, to allow parents and families to be recorded at home alone in their own time. We showed early on, in fact, this was that 2017, that comparing an interaction where they are being watched compared to when you can just look at the data with them alone, you see a pretty large, like a 1.5 standard deviation increase in less socially desirable behavior. So not only so-called negative things like more criticism or more distraction or engagement, but also silly things like singing to babies or doing a baby voice. So things that you wouldn't do, but that are what mums do all the time. So that was what then sold to the EU to say, look, these 2nd, 3rd generation of this study, we could nest in this better way of measuring. Which we had this first style head cam, so an upside down face. And we also, so this is the kind of, there's nobody there, the mums have set this up alone, and we get these kind of snapshots. So I'll show you if you want. I believe put together by Miguel himself, this particular footage, didn't you? You did? So I was in an epidemiology era during this stage of my career, so I was really just thinking about minimizing bias. But what you also get a sense when you watch that is these different perspectives. The first person perspective, watching it back as if you're the mum or the baby, we put it all here together, but we're playing around with watching it in different ways, actually. And you'll see that took us into he's very much now taking me in a different direction of thinking of the power of the footage, actually, as well as the tools. So anyway, that's what it looks like. It looks better than that now. It's got a better camera, but this mum gave us permission to use this. So we don't just show videos. Obviously, this mum's given full permission. It's actually been on the BBC several times, and so we can use it. We do have better footage now, but and better cameras, because we rapidly began to realise what we've got here, but we really can't credibly be using upside down smiley faces and little ribbons. So we actually with a technology company, took the concept and have made better cams, which I brought with me, and are making their way to Brazil next. Here some of them, they have that, some of the South African team. They've now been used all over the world, and we're hoping to make even better versions, which I will talk about at the end. So then, what you're going to do with better capture of information about the parent-child relationship is one thing. Then, well, how do you understand the behavior? And again, I felt like a bit constrained by the tools that are out there. Like, I must follow some checklist of, does mum show this, and that's sensitive. And it's like, well, who are we to decide what that is? So I felt like what we wanted to do is just break parenting interactions into the tiniest components, like breaking a vase, and reconstruct it. So we did hours and hours and hours and hours and years of work. We decided to do a mutually exhaustive, mutually exclusive, all the different types of behavior. So microcoding is all the tiny components at every time point, and we use this lovely tool, Observer. We do the different members of the dyad, and you construct them together. In fact, we got to the point that it was not possible to add anything else, and eventually got cut off. I can't remember exactly what it is, but there's some kind of infinite combinations of behavior. But that's reality. That's what's happening in every moment of interaction. So we've captured it. Now I need to model it. We'll get to that. There's a version of this. I don't think Initial will go into it, but we've pulled together all the great minds, all the different aspects of all the different relevant behaviors, and it is now out there. This manual of how to code and the script to do that. So we can send you that. We can Google this, and we are building up a collection, if you like, of mother-child and father-child interactions that have been coded this way. But particularly in Ausbach, which is what was funded, the Children of the 90s study, that is, sorry. And soon to be Brazil. And I haven't put it on this slide because it's teenagers, but I will mention it briefly. We've also now started nesting in older ages. So that's quite exciting. That's there to be used. We've only touched the surface. We've only really coded facial expression and visual attention thus far. So now what do we do with all of this information, and why can we make a difference now? And interestingly enough, I think the gift that we've got, and I know there's a lot of work here in this department from what I've seen today about innovation and digital, we have suddenly embarked on a kind of computational power to deal with the 37 times 37 by every microsecond of the behavior. And I just a week ago was in Oxford at a previous boss, mentor of mine, and Professor Alan Steiglinger's office, and he gave to me, and I've actually brought them to pass on as a souvenir, an output from 20 years ago when he did his PhD of and I'll show you if this visual works, of just one small line, and this is actual kind of, as my daughter demonstrating t-tests, okay, that would have told you one t-test. That's like one piece of information to say a baby looks at their mum. Right, great. This next, if it will work, you guys gone. That is me doing, I think it's a latent M+ model. I couldn't, by the time I clicked it, it stopped and created it. And that is based on, I don't know, like 2,000 iterations. There's about 400 items into the latent variable, regressing on an outcome 18 years later, and it's click of a button. So we are getting there now, okay, to be able to do it. But input in, you need to know what you're putting in. So we can now really try to understand these interactions, hopefully in a way that's helpful. AI can also help us because people are going in and coding. What's the facial expression? What's the visual attention? We can now get computers to do that and tell us what the facial expressions are. Here I'm showing surprise. But what you also get, which is better, different to what our human coder would, you get a variation of emotion. It's not as simple as one. You get a quantitative signal and you get a timestamp, which I'm very interested in time. I'm very interested in transitions of emotions rather than, again, just now you're happy, now you're sad. So we really can reshake up, rethink about what these interactions actually are. Triangulating with those earlier components, which I think are pointing to that being the target of how we can improve it. And it's like, well, how do we know the computer knows what it's doing? We don't, but this is an interesting validation check I did right when I first got this software, just for fun. When England, I know there's some soccer fans around, but when England did make it to the final of the World Cup, and their manager Gareth Southgate was interviewed directly after, and I ran his face through this program, and never have I had a 0.9 from 0 to scale, right? That is validation. I didn't do it after they've lost to Italy straight after, but it's like rather happy. And I'll come back to this. This is one example, but we do still need to question what the ground truth is, and the computer is constructing it from facial muscles and various things, but we want to check before we start modeling it that that's something valid, and this is one way. There are others which I'll come on to. See, there you go. So of all of those different aspects, it's very important, and I've kind of mentioned this throughout, but a key part of this program, which has just cut, I am writing a report for it now, actually, this EU guide, is to try to remember how to triangulate these different pieces of information together and say how and when we target, I don't even like the word target, but we support and strengthen interactions, and that is what I think triangulator is pointing to. So the last I'll move on, I think. Component then is to see what happens when you do target parenting, and what do we know about that. So in brief, I don't know, you're more than aware of this as well. So Miguel is over here from his PhD. There's lots and lots of parenting interventions, very complicated, very expensive, not that popular, can be stigmatizing. We don't really know how they work. We know that overall, if you compare them to, and I'll get to this, we'll compare them to like a control group, which depends what it is, there seems to be overall small effectiveness for preventing child mental health problems, but we're really not sure what's going on. So we've used an approach to relook at all the trials out there on parenting interventions and break them down into components. So looking at a network meta-analysis to also, two things you were doing there is we're kind of looking at the components, but we're also looking at different comparators. And again, took a lot longer than we expected, because it's like in the end got 59 randomized controlled trials from around the world. Some of them, brilliant PhD student Ilaria, who was constantly asking authors, because I think it ended up like 30% of what's gone in there was previously unpublished because they didn't mention the emotional outcome. All of this work is about behavioral problems, because that's what's causing parents, an immediate problem. Mental health, anxiety, depression is coming, and it's going to cause a bigger problem later, but they haven't really thought about it. So many of them had it underneath the scenes, because, a lot of our development psychology tools have it in there, but hadn't put it in. So this is brand new data, a lot of it. Before I present the results, though, I guess even whilst doing this, I had this kind of, partially because my own experience of my daughter's going through mental health problems, you start to realize what it feels like to be the other side of suggested changes in your relationship or parenting, and the way that it's presented can do more harm than good. But actually, what we're really trying to say here is, what if we find that a cause and effect of parenting? What does that mean, actually? And I don't think it means it's the cause at all. I think it's you can be a solution without being a cause. And here's an example of why, or a different way of thinking about that, and then we'll come to the results. Is that, say, we tend to think of it quite simplistically, I think, in health. So say you're feeling fatigued, you're feeling like you've put on weight and very sluggish. You go to the doctors, you get a blood test, you realize you've got a low thyroid, you've got low thyroxine, you're prescribed thyroxine. Okay, the solution is very linked to the cause. The low thyroxine caused the symptoms, you fix it by doing that, right? But it was the cause. Another example, you're on the football pitch and you're fouled and you've got an injury, right? So now you've got an injury. The solution there is physiotherapy, let's say. But the physiotherapy has nothing to do. I do physiotherapy before to stop you getting fouled. And then maybe that is where we need to see parenting. So when we think about the messaging about if parenting works, it doesn't mean it's because they were bad parents before. It just means bringing them in now that there's an issue. So we're using the power of the relationship, adapting the parenting, because there might be, this is genetically, emotionally vulnerable, maybe there's other things, but it's adapting, okay? It's not, and that is why I think, and we've got the event on Monday, which I know is more applied, and we've been working more on business kind of models recently in the university, and an event I went to, kind of really a message I took from it was about, in business, no one really thinks about what works or concentrates on what works. They think about what people want. And no point how something works if no one wants it. That's the problem in parenting. It might work under certain conditions. Parent doesn't want that. I didn't want it. It was unhelpful until you went pitch this way. Eventually you realize that if you're told you're the solution and adapting can help, it's a different thing. So we did in our slightly crazy network separate out different aspects of parenting components. In interest of time, I won't go into them in detail. You can read this paper. Also, importantly, different comparators, waitlist controls, dummy controls, which are attention match or just treatment as usual, which could be anything, it's hard to know, and various things like actually working with the relationship, video feedback, psychoeducation. Long story short, the only components to have so obviously reducing the in preventing, I suppose, later mental health problems in the child was perhaps unhelpfully what we call dyad. We went around in circles on terms here, but that's when it involves the relationship, not one or the other, not telling the mum what to do, not working on it. It was about more behaviorally strengthening the relationship. But I think perhaps more importantly, that being on a wait list made it actively worse, considerably actively worse. So number one, it's a problem. If you're going to suggest someone needs help and then make them wait for it, you're making it worse. But two, all of these big names, and I won't go into some of the trials that fall under this, are comparing it to something that made it worse. So they didn't make it better, they just compared it to something that made it worse. So be a bit skeptical of some of the so-called evidence-based parenting interventions, because they're actually comparing it to something that made it worse. Ooh, that was very simple. I would have been a bit nicer on that slide. Anyway, get the point. Okay, good. I'm not doing too bad. So really what we come to then is, and this is a little bit abstract, I'm sorry, but it'd be nice to end on, is where we're thinking now, what is this relationship then, if that's what we're going to focus on, the dyadic relationship? And I'm in the process of putting together a big new centre bit, which is all based on what we want to call the Leverhulme Centre of Human Connection, But the whole point is that we don't really understand what that is. So it's a very simplistic way of, human to human being connected. And we're actually looking at kind of metaphors from biology. Quantum physics is giving us some of the best ones. So I think, what other ways are there, and how can that crazy amount of microcoded data, AI and all those things into it kind of help us to test these? So maybe it's not exactly a connection, it's more of a bond or some kind of field between. Perhaps then, interestingly enough, and this is, I think, where neurodiversity comes into it. One time, one of the most useful things somebody did once say to me in explaining some of my daughter's behaviour is, I don't think she understands where she ends and you begin. And that's a nice and complicated, but complicated way to understand relationships. So a connection might be actually fused. There might be another way of thinking about it. Another one is an intertwined idea that actually there's the third, there's a saying, I think it came from the Bible actually, but the third chord in the plait is the strength. Okay, so the two parts are intertwined with some kind of strength, and we might be able to model what that strength is. I like this. This came from, again, a different way of thinking about it. So somebody with ADHD who said this is how it feels like to them. Interactive. So the way you connect with somebody is you mishmash, and then it brings it to a focus. So an interactive model. So that's just, it's all very well to say the relationship's important, but we need to understand what it is. The only other thing I will say from that review is that we also need to, if you think about what was effective for the parent, which was our secondary outcome, it was having not wayness, that really particularly bad for parent outcomes like parental efficacy and confidence, which makes sense, but also the aspects of their own needs, particularly when their own mental health needs to be considered. So, and again, I'll go for all of these different ways of conceptualizing it. Okay, so whether that's a moderator of what you do, because it's quite different, as say, to be given a parental intervention if your parent's depressed compared to the not, might be a moderator. It might actually be part of the component. We might need to think about actually if it's going to worsen their mental health, which some of them do, or if it's going to improve it, or whether or not actually it kind of, it ideally improves the parental mental health itself. And actually one of the things you need to think about, some of the simple things that can be done, is to consider, at least ask. In the UK, child and adolescent mental health services don't even ask. A child will turn up for mental health problems. Everyone's separate. They don't ask the parents how the parent is. But as I say, the parent, what they're going to do with the child is completely different according to the status of the parent. So that's a simple message we're going to maybe think about during my visit here. Is that something that okay, in early years, perinatally, almost worldwide is happening, but it doesn't end there, and maybe that's something to think about. That's on the digital tools, but I the last part of my talk, possibly I was thinking about, but it is that we've done this in teenagers now, but that's, I think, where I will end it. People and I can show those later. So that was the break of that part. And the last component was just about some funny clips from teenagers, but hurts our brains too much, I think.
Gracias, Rebeca. ¿Tienen algunos comentarios, preguntas?
Thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. It's also amazing. My question is maybe broader, but what do you need as a researcher in terms of the environment at the national, local, even at the university level, to be able to do this kind of complex research? And I think that's something we can take to our environment.
I'm going to go to my tree at the end. This is some of the new fancy stuff that, okay, there you go. What you need, this is a tree metaphor for that. That question is, why do a tree is that the roots, and that's why, see Miguel, you're on the branch, the roots of a tree are matched by the branches. So there's what an environment needs to do is have the right. If you give that initial route, then people will start. Oh, I've got to go up. Why not? The branches then are the BBC or get allowed to paper. It will self-reinforce if there's the right things. So the environment, I put things like Auspat data set. I mean, I didn't do that study. It was there, and I know that's a privilege from certain settings, but there was data there, so I have an idea. I can analyze the data. So leaving Bristol, I haven't left Bristol actually. I still have access, and I've still got a 10% contract because I know this is a problem. Unblocking access, I know we've got to weigh that up with security, but making things more accessible so that people can use it without having to go through loads of admin. Having these people, teams, digital tools, and another thing when I've been at some of these funders in the UK and they're getting more business minding is time. So it takes like 18 months to get funding, and I live life on the edge to get these. I had to fight very hard for a lot of this research. I was like a month away from having no job. Some of it paid off, and so from Bristol's terms, it means a success, but it's not really it's not a great way to live. But I think that so certainly where I am now, they do provide that kind of interim funding, so people can fight for external money because you don't know when you're getting it. So I guess that's the other thing. But it's modeling a bit, and what I think I've done is I've kind of mixed together high risk creative, like the headcams, with some sure bets. But my sure bets are using that paper, the JAMA psychiatry paper was an easy thing to do if you have an idea because you've got the data there. It's on my computer. Say I'm going to get hundreds of mums and babies to wear a camera was high risk. You need a bit of both. I think you need things that do the papers and all that. Yeah.
I will add to that. My experience just being a PhD student there and seeing how Rebecca was running her career, that the point was having an environment that people support her in different ways and push and really giving freedom to think differently and to go for it. And despite many of traditional institutions in the UK also are looking that you are trying to bring more money because that's the business, to bring money to the institution. But also having a lot of students working around, and I can see also my colleagues here at the Center of Epidemiology and Health Policy that they work so much hard teaching and also producing research that sometimes you can see that you can't see how much you are doing as you do because you're living there. And maybe the big distance between us is the infrastructure in terms of data. So what they have in Bristol is a whole department, admin, how to collect data in a scale that is not comparable what we do here. So there is a lot of people just dedicated to that aspect, that bring the data and make the data available for the researchers answering their questions.
But also you have to adapt. There are people that I worked alongside that haven't, and I think I adapt to what's needed. I think that's it. I mean, so now I've moved towards adolescence. There's a mental health crisis in adolescence. I've adapted. That's fundable. That's what people want now. So if you have the assets, the data assets in your environment, you have to adapt and be flexible.
Yeah, and do things that are sexy at the moment. So
what you want to do, be a bit challenging. They have been quite supportive to me, but at times not. Times they tell me no, and I do it don't completely do that. You don't do it anyway, but you can start to do they didn't want me to do the headcount stuff. They were like, that will never get funded. 1.5 million later. But I think it's, do you know what? And I've forgotten I did this for my professorship interview. I would say don't negate the impact of enthusiasm, because I think I've managed to have a lot of students work for me just to be part of it for free doing their own thing, because it's be happy, enjoy what you're doing, isn't it? Be enthusiastic and
And invest in the relationship between the researchers. Yeah.
Invest, I mean, use them, empower people around you to do it. And that goes a long, and same time as nurturing, but persistence, of course, blind persistence, just keep going. But it's you can only do what you've got around you. So that's the thing, isn't it? I couldn't have done, I mean, that study alone.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And you gave us too many ideas to be more creative and think and go for what we want to do in our research. And just thinking also in the perspective of what people need. That's maybe the key also for many of us that work for health. Thank you for coming today. And you're welcome to have conversations later today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mika.
Good, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, the last thing we can reach it to teenagers. How you deal with guilty? Because when you talk about something like that,